renowned scholar of ethics. Nita's focused particularly on social and legal challenges posed by emerging technologies. She is founding director of Duke Science and Society. She is chair of the Duke Masters in Bioethics and Science Policy and principal investigator of the Science, Law, and Policy Lab, or the SLAP Lab, which is a lot less threatening, I assure you, than it sounds. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nita Farahany.
It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening, particularly as a fellow alum of Duke, but also to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about my work on the intersection between ethics, law, and policy. I'm going to start by asking you a question, which is, how many of you have ever heard the saying, don't ever put anything in writing that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the New York Times? Lots of you, right? What if I were to tell you that I think that that might be a little bit outdated? That soon, I think you shouldn't think anything that you don't want on the front page of the New York Times. That's what I want to talk with you a little bit about this evening, which is where we're going in society and how we can start to develop some frameworks to be able to address growing technology and ethical challenges that they pose. How many of you wear something like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or another fitness tracking device? How many of you have tried one? A few of you. All right. Well, it turns out that those numbers are actually growing quite a bit. By the year 2020, at least 411 million of these devices, worth an estimated $34 billion, will be sold. People are getting a lot more comfortable with having data about themselves tracked and ultimately shared. Part of it is that people believe that they have a lot of control over this information. They believe that they have some rights with respect to how the information is collected, who they share it with, and how. But already in the employment context, a lot of these different devices are starting to collect information about employees without them having much say over how that information is collected, used, and whether or not it's being used to make decisions about hiring, promotion, and tracking of their work and productivity. Consider this. The company Tesco, which many of you may have heard about, has quite a few subsidiaries. The one I want to talk with you about this evening is their Ireland Grocery Warehousing Corporation, who in 2013 decided to introduce armbands on employees to track their movements throughout the warehouse. The idea was to increase productivity and to decrease the burden on employees. It tracked their movements as they picked up an object from one part of the factory and moved it to the other one. They didn't have to carry around their little clipboards anymore where they were logging as they were moving things because it was automatically tracking where they were going. It was also tracking, for example, when they would take breaks, scheduled breaks. It had room for them to take biological breaks. But there was an uproar by employees. They really didn't like it. Even though it improved their productivity, even though it decreased the burden on them and made it easier for them to do their jobs, they didn't like the sense in which it felt like constant surveillance of their actions. They particularly didn't like that even if they were to take something like an unscheduled break or a biological break, that could count against them in tracking their productivity or in determining whether or not they would be promoted or fired from their jobs. Well, you might say, well, I mean, too bad. It improved productivity for the employees. Isn't that part of what we're trying to do in society? And if they didn't like it, they could just quit. Except it turns out that a lot of employees who are working on factory floors don't have a tremendous amount of upward mobility. And it can't be that privacy or the ability to work in a place without surveillance is a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It has to be, if it's an interest and a right that we have, it's something that's equally available to other people. And what happens when that kind of technology becomes ubiquitous? 60% of companies have said that if they're not already engaged in significant surveillance of their employees, within the next few years they plan to do so. Companies like Walmart, Tesco, Amazon, Google are engaged in significant amounts of tracking of employees. But already, they're shifting from just tracking movements to starting to track minds. There's good reason why employers want to track productivity, attention, and focus of employees. In a recent survey of employees, 80% of them reported that they are significantly distracted in the workplace. They spend time doing things like surfing the web or logging onto social media, online shopping. They're distracted. There are many different distractions, electronic and otherwise, that are taking people's focus away from productivity. And so employers have started to wonder, is there a way that we can track employee attention and focus? And if we can track that employee attention and focus, is there ways that we can optimize it to make employees more productive in the workplace? And as a result, there's the shift that's occurring. The shift to move from the Fitbits and the armbands to being able to track what's happening in people's minds. What you see here is something called SmartCap. SmartCap is a simple baseball cap that has embedded electrodes inside of it that pick up the electrical activity in the brain. As neurons in the brain fire, they create patterns of electrical activity which can be decoded using software and artificial intelligence. We're getting better at this every day. Already with some of these simple EEG devices, we can do things like measure attention and focus, mind wandering. We can start to decode some simple things like simple numbers, words, things that a person is hearing, where their attention is focused, drowsiness. All of this is starting to be something that we can track through a simple baseball cap like this one. There are headbands, they're put into hard caps, there are many different devices. And it turns out that a number of companies around the world are starting to use them on employees.
Smart cap?
Smart cap.
It's a baseball cap.
A baseball cap that measures brainwaves.
To calculate how fatigued you are.
Lets me know when I'm getting tired.
The SmartCap system is a fatigue management tool for operators of heavy equipment. The main innovation lies with the cap. It consists of two parts: the software, which determines fatigue levels from brainwave measurements, and the sensor technology capable of reading brainwaves through hair.
Well, safety is the #1 priority in the mining industry. Up till now, we have only had soft controls for managing fatigue, things like procedures. We always have been on the lookout for some hard controls to help people manage fatigue. It was perfect timing for us. It's innovative in the industry and has wide-ranging benefits, not just within the coal industry.
We see the potential for this tool to be used in a number of different settings, the most important of which are likely to be aviation, public transport, long-haul trucking, and hopefully one day even passenger cars.
Monitoring the brain has tremendous potential. There are great promises to doing things like reducing drowsiness while driving, which is actually one of the leading causes of car accidents. Rather than drunkenness while driving, drowsiness while driving causes a significant amount of fatalities across the world every year. And we as a society should want drivers to be alerted to the fact that they're drowsy while driving. In fact, we've already embraced technology in a number of different vehicles that do things like analyze people's micro changes to a steering wheel or micro changes on the street. So it's maybe not that surprising, given that we've embraced this other technology, that companies, for example, in Australia, that have integrated it into their mines, would be tracking drowsiness in mining, tracking carbon monoxide. It's also maybe not that surprising that across the world, these devices are starting to be adopted, whether in Australia, Chile, China, even the US Olympic team has started to use it. But it's already starting to have implications for individual employees. There are reports of workers in China being sent home if their brain activity shows less than stellar performance or emotional instability that could destabilize the workforce. Unsurprisingly, in a number of contexts in which this kind of information has started to be gathered by employees, there have been protests. In Queensland, in one of the mines in which SmartCap was about to be adopted, there were significant protests from the workers to try to block it from being adopted for fear of reprisal of what kind of information could be collected and how it might be used or misused to make judgments about employees. Ultimately, what's at stake here is a question about what rights individual employees might have and whether or not, given the power imbalance between employees and employers, this is the kind of information that we're comfortable crossing over into collecting. You might say, okay, well, what's the difference? You know, we're collecting information through Fitbit, we're collecting information from our online activity, our Google searches, and every other context. But wasn't your brain the one area that you thought that you had some mental reprieve? The last bastion of freedom, the place that you thought you could have ideas and creativity, fantasize about something, have an absurd idea, have a brilliant idea. Isn't it the one space that you thought would always be secure? Well, maybe you've given up on privacy. Maybe you said, the end has arrived, and so we shouldn't worry that much about it. But I want to argue to you that that shouldn't be the way we think about brain data. It's the one space in which people can have dissident thoughts, can rise up against tyrannical governments, can have oppositional thoughts when an employer is being abusive or creating unfair norms in society. It's the one space in which people can truly define themselves, find themselves. But right now, there's no such thing as mental privacy. There's no such thing as a right that protects your mental space or treats it any differently than any other kind of information that's being collected against us. I think that there are promises to adopting this kind of technology, reducing the cost of accidents, but I think in order for us to do so, we have to substantially increase the transparency about what kind of information is being collected, how it's being collected, and to give individuals control and power over that information. They need to be able to both see what's being collected and the purposes and limited use for which it's being applied. But more than that, we need to define a set of rights with respect to cognitive liberty. The right to have some mental reprieve, the right to have a space that we can call our own. This idea of cognitive liberty would ensure self-access and self-determination over our brains. It would recognize that consent is not enough, particularly given the power imbalance and dynamics that exist within society, that consenting to monitoring in a workplace setting or in other contexts won't be enough. Freedom of thought is in society. Freedom of thought is truly the most foundational right for all other rights that we may have. It is the most pivotal and important thing to any kind of democracy or freedom that people enjoy. What's at stake is not just employee productivity. What's at stake is the kind of society that we want to live in. We can define that together, but the only way we can define that, the only way we can ensure that there's a space that will ensure continued human flourishing is to recognize a right to cognitive liberty, to recognize that there's a balance between individual interest, corporate interest, government interest, reducing the cost of accidents, and more. The future is limitless, but we as a society have to decide what the norms are that will define that. Thank you.
Questions? I would ask you to put your thinking caps on, but I think we've been thoroughly disabused
do
that would be a
that.
healthy direction. And I believe we have runners with microphones. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. And then when you ask a question, please let us know who you are. That would be terrific. And while we're waiting, we do have a question right here.
Hi, I'm Bruce Metke, class of '77. So by creating a right of cognitive liberty, have you already given up on every other kind of liberty that we might have had? Not that I'm afraid of what you just showed on the screen or anything.
Right.
Thank you.
In some ways, yes. Not on every other kind of liberty, but in every kind of privacy. I think that it's, we focus most of our efforts on doing things like data restriction, trying to restrict the flow of information. We haven't focused a lot of time on trying to figure out what misuse of information is in society. This is a space in which I think it isn't just about misuse, it's about access to the information at all. And I think, in general, I've given up on the idea that we're going to be able to restrict access to all other kinds of information. But this, I think, is the final frontier. And I think even the perception of access to information can be threatening. In China, in a lot of the primary schools throughout the country, the students are being required to wear something like the smart cap, but it's just a little headband. And the headband lights up red, green, or orange. The red means not focused. The green means focused. And the orange means that you're starting to have your mind wander. That information is sent real time to the teacher, to the parents, and to the state. What kind of an effect does that have on the ability of those children, even if the technology doesn't work, right? For them to feel like they can think freely, how is that going to change the course of their development? So I think access restrictions in this context is sort of my last hope for privacy for us. And I also think it's probably the most important area because I think that mental space is truly fundamental to all other kinds of freedom.
And the danger that governments would acquire those data is one danger, but there are a lot of commercial entities as well. And
That's right.
Google has just acquired Fitbit. They're
Yes.
moving into health delivery and health services
That's right.
markets. So what are your thoughts about that kind of access to health and biomedical information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Looking at Google with the acquisition of both Fitbit, but also their recent announcements of Project Nightingale, if you guys have seen that in the media, or as some of the people in the media like to call it Project Nightmare, where they were acquiring all of medical records. And on the other side, Facebook has announced recently that they're going to acquire the company that I think is the pivotal company to make this go mainstream, which is a company called Control Labs. Control Labs has developed a little device that's like an armband. The armband detects EMG, that is motor neuron activity going down to your hands, and can decode it. And their idea is to integrate that into everything that they do. Companies are all in on biometric data. And it's not just companies tracking employees, it's companies who are interested, like Google and Facebook, who are interacting with consumers to make this widespread information. And I think, again, there's some promises to this, right? I mean, I don't think we want to block this technology. A person who is paralyzed can suddenly be able to communicate or be able to operate a prosthetic device. Instead of typing while you're driving, which I'm sure none of you do, you could think about sending a text message and it could be translated into your phone. That could improve safety. But what other information is being collected at the same time? Is your cognitive decline over time being detected? Are your brand preferences being detected? All of the kind of information that right now I believe people think is secure suddenly is going to these corporations. And I think corporations are starting to have much more power than many smaller governments are, even some larger governments. And they have ethical duties as well. And we need to define rights that will govern not just how governments act, but also how corporations act.
Some bright lights. Yes, down here in the third row.
Tolu Adewale. Okay. Tolu Adewale, Trinity 06, Law 09. Professor Farahany, how specific and refined could this technology get? Could I go into work, grab a cap from a bin that's not tuned to me and put it on my head, and it can interpret specific thoughts, specific words?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is not yet. Not the tuning to you part, but we can't decode complex thoughts yet. These are pretty simple devices, and they're usually somewhere between 1 to 5 to 15 electrodes. They're dry electrodes unlike medical grade EEG. And even with the best EEG, you can't necessarily decode complex thoughts. That being said, you can decode a lot, and a lot of things that could matter to you. Positive, negative emotions, simple words, shapes that you're seeing. Some people have talked about using them for past thoughts. So interacting with all of your devices would require one of these things because, a little song or a ditty that you sing in your head could be decoded and unique to you. The tuning to you is very quick. Many of these devices only take a few minutes. I tried out the Control Labs device, and it took me about 10 minutes of training on it before it was able to detect pretty much everything. and to operate it quite well. So they're getting better every day, and as artificial intelligence and machine learning improve for decoding patterns, they're getting better every day. There's still some limitations because of the spatial resolution, how deep into the brain they can go to actually decode what's happening there. And so, the possibility that they're really going to do real-time mind reading, as people think of it, I think is limited for this kind of device. That's why a lot of companies like Neuralink, Facebook, Google are investing in more invasive technology to figure out if maybe one day we might all be willing to have implanted electrodes in our brain to decode everything. And you laugh, but there are a lot of people who are ready for that, see the benefits of it, and don't recognize the risks of doing so.
Other questions? I apologize for it's a little bit bright.
I see one in the back, too.
Oh, the back there, yes.
All the way in the back?
Right about there, but on the other
I
side
saw
of the
one
house.
here, hand up. Yeah.
Yes,
We're letting the president pick, yeah.
thank you. Perfect.
He's got to pick you first.
Great.
Jessica Everd, class of Trinity 05. What is the status of the protests so far and any legal legislation that might be in process or any legal rights that exist today?
So in April, the Wall Street Journal broke news of the children in China being tracked in the primary schools. Last week, some parents started protesting in China about the collection of this information on their children. I think that's promise, especially in a society like China where there's actually a significant amount of this being used in factories, on train conductors, and more. As for rights, some people are starting to talk about it. There is a universal, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's freedom of thought, but that's primarily been believed to be relevant to religious ability to exercise religious freedoms. It hasn't been interpreted in this context. The GDPR in Europe creates some privacy regulations, but almost nothing is, nothing is specific to brain data. Nothing carves it out uniquely. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to recognize it uniquely because there's so many encroachments on data collection that recognizing this is a special protected space, that mental privacy matters, that we need to recognize, celebrate it, and understand that freedom of thought is the linchpin to all other freedoms. That's the conversation that I'm hoping is starting to happen.
Yes, we have time for perhaps one more question here.
Mark Pinsky, Trinity 70. I have a question for Dr. Farahany, which is not specific to privacy, but on our larger area of ethics and technology. And that is a technological road not taken by Duke. Earlier this week, the Raleigh News and Observer carried a quote from a Durham City Council member on the subject of light rail. And he said, Duke's decision to kill the light rail project sadly reinforces the worst fears of many Durham residents. That Duke University is an arrogant and elitist enclave with little interest in being the kind of partner this city needs. My question is, in terms of ethics and technology, and how long do you think it will be before Duke comes to its senses and reverses itself on the decision to endorse light rail as a way to reduce carbon impact and many other things?
So, I think it's a great example, right, which is every technology brings with it risks and benefits, right? I mean, what I hope that you took away from this talk is that there are great promises. There are great applications of this technology. Light rail, there are great applications. There's also significant risks. And trying to find a balance for any new technological developments, for any new invention, requires that we understand that society will be impacted by that technology. We can and should embrace new technology. It's inevitable, right? Whether it's light rail, EEG headsets, any other kind of device. But we also have to recognize that there are significant risks to populations, to individuals, and that the right answer is to try to find that balance, to always be looking for that balance, to try to figure out how to enable technology to progress, but to progress as responsible technology in a way that's best for society. Thank you.